Okay, Helen.
Good evening, everyone, and it's brilliant to see so many people join us once again for what is, I suppose, the beginning of our Historical Society year. We start in September and we go right around to next September again. So it is brilliant to see everyone and to see some familiar faces again of people who has continued to join us over the last year and a half. On a night like this, which is a little bit chilly out, it is nice to be sitting by the fire. And we thank Niall Heenan again for hosting this and allowing us the opportunity to have our talks in the warmth of our own home. Again, over the next few months, we have different talks lined up, and we will notify you of those in just after Christmas. We hope to have one for January, February, and March in the new year. I'm not going to delay much longer because I want to introduce Lisa. But before I do, I know that it's a while since I saw a lot of people, a lot of you, and just to express our gratitude for all the support over the last year and a half, because by you joining us has helped us to stay, I suppose, keep ourselves interested in our society and keep ourselves going. I also would like to express sympathy to anyone who had bereavements over the past year. And this evening, we remember our local girl from Ballinderry, Michelle Keating, who died yesterday and was a member of the society. And just to express sincere sympathy to her parents, Eamon and Noreen, and her sister Sharon. And Michelle was a great support to us when she came into Ballinderry a couple of years ago. So we remember Michelle and we remember all those who died in the past 12 months. Now Lisa. Lisa is a local girl, and we're delighted to welcome Lisa tonight because Lisa there last year did an article for us for our journal, or the year before, on the poor law. And I suppose, Lisa, this in many ways is a follow-up from that, with your interest in the nursing and the midwifery from 1882 to 1922. And I'm not going to go into any more detail because I'm not, I don't have that knowledge. I'm hoping that by the end of this I will. Lisa, a nurse yourself, very capable, and you did your master's in 2020, or completed them.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, I'm going to leave it over to the person who knows more about it than I do. So Lisa, thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you, Helen.
Look forward to your talk.
Lovely, thanks very much, Helen. I must thank you on behalf of the Kilbarron Glass Historical Society for actually inviting me to talk. It's a real pleasure, and it's lovely to see so many people here. And I really hope that you'll enjoy tonight's talk. It's a topic that I have a real interest in. I'd like to thank Niall Heenan as well for the IT support and setting up the Zooms. I know we're in capable hands, and hopefully I'll keep it within the time limit. That's my thing. So as Helen said, yeah, I trained as a nurse in Portiuncula Hospital. So I qualified in 1991. And then as a midwife from the National Maternity Hospital in Holles Street in Dublin in 1995, and then as a public health nurse in 1999, so from UCD. And then I thought that was going to be the end of my formal education, maybe until I retired or something and did something for fun. But a few years ago, I started working as a volunteer tour guide in the Irish Workhouse Centre in Portumna. Hi, David and James and anyone else who's joining us from there. And I was really delighted when the team there, which at the time included Steve Dolan, John Joe Conwell and Christy Kniff. And I think I heard you say that Dr. Christy Kniff has spoken to you and given a talk here, but they decided that, as you know, to use the buildings better in Portumna, that they would develop and deliver a certificate in local history. So I thought, that's brilliant, I'll sign up for that, that's great. And I was loving that. And then in the middle of that, then the supervisor for the Masters in Local History from UL came and said, you know, this certificate is aligned to UL and it makes you eligible for the Masters. So all of a sudden, 6 of us decided we'd sign up for the Masters. And so in September 2018, I found myself heading off to UL one night a week for a 2-year part-time Masters. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. So at the end of that, we had to produce or submit a 20,000 word thesis. And this talk tonight really is based on that thesis. So I looked at the development of nursing and midwifery in the poor law unions of Nina and Bursa Kane between 1882 and 1922. And I picked those years. I suppose the 1922, as you'll all know, is the kind of the forming of the Irish Free State. So any of the institutions that existed under the British law and British occupation would have ceased soon after 1922. So that's my ending date. And then in that 40-year period between 1882 and 1922, nursing in particular took, really developed from being very, there was hardly any training for nurses. And most people who worked as nurses were untrained in 1882. And that really transitioned all through that 40-year period until in 1918, you couldn't, with the Nurses Act, you couldn't work as a nurse unless you had a qualification, and equally the Midwives Act, you couldn't work as an independent midwife unless you had qualifications. So we're looking at a time period when nursing changed very significantly from untrained to trained, and all the reforms that happened. And from the point of view of this talk, what I found was, and actually I was quite surprised by, but a lot of that nursing, where were those nurses employed? And the majority of them were employed in some form of institution that fell under the poor laws. So mostly the dispensary system, so that was the district midwives, or the nurses in the workhouse infirmaries. So that might be a surprise to most people. I know it was to me. We think of the workhouse system as the workhouse and these horrible institutions where the poor people were housed. But actually, as I'll show in the talk tonight, from about 1862, they became really de facto district hospitals. And once you have a district hospital, you need staff for it, and the staff came about in the form mostly of nurses. So that's what we're looking at tonight. And I just want to give a bit of a disclaimer before I start, in that some of the terminology that I will use in, say, the names of the hospitals, I don't use it a lot. I'm using the terms that were used at the time that I'm writing. So the psychiatric hospitals were known as asylums. So if there's any terms like that, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I'm using the terminology that was present at the time. So I hope that's okay for everybody. So I am just going to bring up my, start my slideshow. Oh, I had this ready to go, sorry now. Here we go. Right, I've given you all that there already. So now this is the only photograph that I have for tonight, and it's not actually perfect. Lovely. That's great. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. So this is the only photograph we have tonight, I'm afraid. I don't have photos of any of the women that I'm speaking about. Now, there's one of them I think I can get in time, but I haven't at the moment. So this is just really to show what the uniforms looked like at the period of time we're looking at. I think these are women who worked for the Red Cross during the First World War. So we're talking about that 1915 kind of period of time. So the uniforms were something like this. So very much the starched aprons and the hats and long dresses. But yeah, we have no more photographs, I'm afraid. So To get into the 1882, to understand maybe what's happening in 1882, I'm just going to go back a bit and look at what kind of provision was there, what kind of public health provision was there in Ireland prior to 1882. And there was quite an amount of it. It just wasn't necessarily organised that there was access for everybody. And maybe that's what the poor law provision brought about, that there was equal access for everybody. But there was a lot of charities offering healthcare, because really people who went into institutions like hospitals for healthcare were mostly the poor. Wealthier people could be cared for in their own homes. There was voluntary hospitals, so say there Jervis Street opened around 1718. The first maternity hospital in Ireland was the Rotunda in 1745, but we also had one not that much later in Limerick. Most babies were born at home though, and it was seen as the safer place to be born. But if there was a problem, or if someone was extremely poor or they had no housing, then it was into the maternity and lying in hospital. Very much a charitable institution. And then there was specialist hospitals, so say for skin diseases, infectious diseases. And you see there the Westmoreland Street Lock Hospital that was formed in 1792. That was specifically for women with venereal diseases, sexually transmitted diseases. The women were locked up. They had to stay for 9 months with syphilis or whatever. So there were specialist hospitals, again, run mostly by charities. And then there was a certain amount of kind of public health at a county level. So there was county infirmaries. Every county had an infirmary starting from about 1765. There was houses of industry in major cities. So Cork, Limerick, Dublin would have had a house of industry for the poor, and they would have had hospitals attached to them. The Richmond Lunatic Asylum was the first psychiatric hospital kind of opened in this modern health care era, and that was from 1814. The dispensary system, and I'll talk a bit about the dispensary system, because that is one of the systems that under the poor laws was revised and redeveloped. So it did start in 1805, and it would have been funded by private subscriptions and also from the grand juries. So the petty sessions and the fines that people would have paid to the grand juries would have supported the dispensary system, but it wasn't equal around the country. You generally had a dispensary where you had people who could afford to set them up. You didn't have them in the poorest areas, and that would have changed in the 1851, where they were much more equally distributed. You also had fever hospitals all around the country starting from about 1816, and boards of health were developed from 1818 in response to a lot of the epidemics. I won't use pandemic tonight. Epidemics that started, especially cholera epidemics from 1818. There was different waves of them, and the boards of health organized the building of temporary fever hospitals or cholera hospitals. And then the workhouse infirmaries were available initially from 1842 when they first opened. They were available for the workhouse inmates who were sick. And then they, from 1852, under the Medical Charities Act, or 1851 to say, they transferred to widening their admission to the destitute poor who were sick, who weren't necessarily inmates of the workhouse. And then from 1862, they were open to the public, and anybody could avail of the medical services in the workhouse infirmary. If you had the money to pay for it, you were meant to. It was often hard for them to get the money from the patients, and the Board of Guardians who ran each workhouse spoke about that at their Board of Guardians meetings. They weren't terribly happy about that. So that's kind of looking at what we had. Now, specifically for Tipperary, our county infirmary was in Cashel. Now, Cashel's not very helpful if you live in Bursacane or Nina for a hospital. And then between 1811 and 1825, there was 4 fever hospitals. So I suppose for North Tip, we have there Roscrea and Templemore. Then Clonmel got an infirmary in 1829, the asylum in 1835. And by the late 1840s, there were 12 fever hospitals and 46 dispensaries in Tipperary. And by 1853, there was 4 workhouses in North Tip. So there was Nina and Bursacane, which we'll talk about tonight. There was Thurles and Roscrea as well. And there was 5 in South Tipperary, and they all had infirmaries. So it's the infirmary part that we're kind of interested in tonight. Then also on top of that, so that's your general public health provision, but there would have been private health provision at the same time. And the newspapers of the day had lots of ads for the doctors, physicians, surgeons, apothecaries and druggists. And then some midwives used to advertise as well in the newspaper, not as necessarily midwife, maybe as a maternity and monthly nurse or as an accouchée. And then colloquially, we tend to refer to untrained midwives at the time as handy women. They didn't really use that term from what I can see at the time, but there was one woman in Nina was brought up in court, something happened and she was to give evidence, and she said, "I'm a knowledgeable woman." So I said it very much ties in with what the French call their midwives, which is un sage femme, a wise woman. So yeah, there's lots of different names for the midwives. And then there was herbalists and healers and folk cures. Now those weren't advertised in the newspaper, but you'll find a lot of those in the Ducas, the school's collection. The children wrote a lot of stories about folk cures and healers. I think David Broderick has written a little bit about that. He's featured that a bit, haven't you, David? So then once the poor law legislation came into Ireland in 1838, and the building of workhouses, it also had an element of healthcare provision or public health care. And that should actually say 1849, that Amendment Act. So the first workhouses were built, or they were opened by 1842. And so, as I said, with that, there was the infirmaries, but the Medical Charities Act, so it kind of reorganized and extended the dispensary service. So that dispensary service that was a bit ad hoc and it was only in places where they could afford to finance it and run one, there was dispensaries were better, they were distributed more evenly. And the dispensary was a place where there was a doctor provided to the working poor, not so much the destitute poor as the working poor, because even back in 1805, the powers that be recognized that if a poor man who was working and supporting his family became ill and couldn't work or was injured and didn't have access to medical care, that he soon became a pauper and then was a larger drain on their resources. So that's why the dispensary system was started, to provide kind of free healthcare to those who were eligible, but it's generally the working poor. And so the dispensary system was extended and it brought other charities in under the poor laws, and it opened the workhouse infirmaries to the destitute sick so that they could avail of the workhouse, but equally they could avail of the dispensary. So a dispensary, somebody asked me one day, what's that? And it's where medicine and medical care were dispensed. So they were given, often the doctors were making up their own potions. They had basic ingredients and then they were making up concoctions. And people could see the dispensary doctor on a black or a red ticket. So the black ticket was where you could attend the dispensary itself and the doctor might be there 2 days a week. And on the other ticket, you actually got a home visit. So that was the difference between the ticket system. The Poor Relief Act of 1862 then extended the workhouse infirmary, that all sick could use the workhouse infirmary. And I see that, I'll show you in my slides, that when you look at the 1901 and 1911 censuses, you can see very much that the workhouse is being used as a poor, like it's used for its healthcare, and also as aged care. So those two areas, the elderly are there for long stay and then people are using it. They're also using it because they're poor and they need a roof over their head, but they are using it very much. They're using the infirmary as the local hospital. And then in 1872, the whole management of the poor law system changes from the poor law commissioners to local government board. And then in 1898, in 1896, actually, there was an organization, a voluntary organization. It's a workhouse reform organization was formed, and they really lobby for reforms to the workhouse system and in particular to the infirmaries. So they really object to inmates of the workhouse being used as nurses. It was one of the jobs the inmates were given, was that you could be a nurse in the infirmary, male and female. So the men would work on the male side and the women on the female side. But they were known as pauper nurses. And from 1898, there was a prohibition of that. So if you stop using pauper nurses, if you stop using a free workforce that's on site, you have to employ somebody for that job. So therein comes some of these jobs that we're looking for these qualified nurses that are coming up in the system in that time. So nursing and midwifery, I have them separated out as two different professions. I know I have both qualifications, and for a long time to be a midwife, you needed to be a nurse. But back in the time we're talking, and actually back now again, midwifery is a standalone qualification. And in this time period, many people who worked as midwives just did midwifery. They didn't do nursing care as well. Some midwives at the time would have been traditionally trained. It followed in families. Mothers passed it down to daughters or nieces. And they were the local woman you went to help with the delivery of your baby and care during your pregnancy. Whereas nursing, a nurse tended to be employed in an institution. So some of those hospitals that I mentioned there. In the 1800s, nursing had a very low status. It was a very undesirable job, and it was seen as a low form of charing, so a low form of domestic service. A lot of nurses that worked in, say, the county hospitals would have been maybe ex-patients that didn't have anywhere else to go, and really for bed and breakfast, they would wash the floor, set the fire, cook the meals. It was that kind of work that the nurse did, and then, cleaning up after patients, feeding them. It wasn't, as I said, not a very desirable job. But as the 1800s progressed, scientific discoveries and science was progressing. Germ theory was developed, that whole focus on improved sanitation and improved medical knowledge. And I think in Ireland at that time, there was a really high regard for our doctors. So the medical institution, medicine had really progressed, but those doctors then needed assistance from nurses who were educated and who were obedient. So this was one of the avenues from which kind of the push for educated nurses was coming. It was from doctors, they were making demands for educated and obedient nurses. And then doctors also didn't like this whole idea of midwives who weren't qualified, because they were kind of their competition out there. And the midwives were cheaper than the doctor if they were looking for the same business. So midwives tended to be vilified, those ones that were untrained. They were accused of being spreaders of disease. They were accused of being drunkards, untrustworthy, and they're often epitomized as a Sarah Gamp type character. Now, Sarah Gamp was a fictitious character that Charles Dickens wrote about in a book called Martin Chuzzlewit. And she wasn't a midwife, but she was a nurse who was always, I think, pilfering from her employers, and she was loud and she was brash. So this was kind of the whole dialogue at the time was, we don't want this type of woman looking after women in labor. We want somebody who's, more refined, more educated, from a better background. And also at this time, it was very difficult for women, especially middle and upper class ladies, to actually work to be employed. It wasn't socially acceptable for them to have jobs, but they could take on positions of say in a voluntary capacity. They'd be on boards. They did a lot of voluntary work, a lot of philanthropy, and they got positions as lady superintendents. So they'd be in charge, but not necessarily qualified as nurses. But there was a real push for this group of ladies to maybe have a type of employment that was seen as socially acceptable and didn't diminish them, but also was valuable work. So there was a push from that. So there was a lot of different people looking for reform and to develop nursing for a different class of women. And then, as I said, the poor law reforms really put demand out there for qualified nurses and midwives, and to get rid of all these unqualified people. So nursing reform. So nursing reform started early. I'm sure we've all heard of Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp and helping the men in the Crimea. And apparently at the same time that Florence was there was some Irish Sisters of Mercy were also there doing much the same. So bringing cleanliness, bringing order, keeping the infectious sick and those with injuries separate to each other. So they had a lot of success with that type of basic good nursing, what we now call good modern nursing. But from the 1860s, Florence was really pushing for nursing. But if you see there, we didn't have really standardized nurse training and certification didn't come until the 1890s. The first Irish nursing schools did open in the 1860s, but it said no standardization till the 1890s. And the first examinations for midwives came in the 1870s, even though there had been training for midwives for a long time before that. And then in terms of the legislation, there was a Midwives Act for England and Wales that came into place in 1902. So by 1902, only those who were qualified could attend women, unless the unqualified could attend with a doctor. They couldn't attend on their own, it was illegal. That legislation came to Scotland in 1915 and to Ireland in 1918, and then nursing registration from 1919. So that's coming nearly to the end of my 1922 time period. So that fits in kind of nicely. By then, they're nearly all qualified. So this was an image that was published in a nursing magazine in 1888. And they were looking at the changes that had happened in 50 years. So our first character here is the Sarah Gampish, kind of slovenly and maybe supposed to be drunk and sort of elderly and not, she's meant to epitomize the undesirable nurse. And here we have the kind of clean cut, young, neatly dressed, qualified nurse. So they were looking at the difference of 50 years. So this is the type of media propaganda maybe that was out at the time, but they really vilified one type of nurse over the other. And we're really promoting this idea of the qualified nurse. So I had a little look. So we're talking about nurses, and I was wondering, okay, well, how many nurses did we actually have in Ireland in 1901? Well, more specifically in Tipperary. So if you look at the people on the census who returned their occupation as nurse, it comes out at 410. So there was 410 women said that there were nurses. There was no men, maybe one male nurse in all of 1901. But when you broke that down, about 260 of those were working in some sort of domestic service. I found predominantly maybe employed by a family that had young children. So they were involved mostly in childcare. Some would have maybe been companions for elderly people, but mostly it was childcare. Only 96 of the whole population of Tipperary at the time, which was about 160,000, only 96 were actually nurses or midwives. And then 55, it was unknown. It was hard to determine what. And if I break that down further, for the Nenagh and Borrisokane area, that number of nurses, midwives was 24. So in the whole of Nenagh and Borrisokane, we had 24 nurses, qualified, but working in nursing. They mightn't necessarily have been qualified. It doesn't say. They have lots of different names for themselves, but there was 24 nurses. And if we go then to 1911, so the population of the county has reduced by 8,000 to 152,000, but the number of people who are nursing or who returned themselves as nurse was 478. But of that, then we have this much higher number of 215 who were actually working as a nurse or a midwife, a lot less in the unknown category, and still a similar number in domestic service. It's still the larger portion. And then of that 215, 38 of those were in the Nenagh and Borrisokane areas. So almost well, not quite a double, but at least another 50%. So definitely an increase in the number of nurses in the two poor law unions between 1901 and 1911. And the age range of them as well was between 12 and 90. So that's also an indicator. The 12-year-old definitely isn't qualified as a nurse. So they were working, employed to look after children in a house. And it was just interesting, when there was that whole push for qualified nurses was coming from the upper and middle class ladies, and they really were promoting that whole reform in nursing and opening up of jobs. So I had a little look at what was the socioeconomic background of those nurses, those 38-ish, the 38 in 1911 and the 24 in 1901. So what was their background? So we have there, the majority of them had, their fathers were farmers. They were coming from farming backgrounds. That we had 2 whose fathers were policemen, 4 who were labourer servants, 2 that were, the fathers were in the army, 1 where the father was a shopkeeper, 2 where the father was a tradesman, 1 whose father was a sea captain, and 1 whose father was an engine driver. So it's very much in that working and working class and farmer class, but it's not in that it's not in the pauper class where it had been, say, in the early 1800s. It definitely, it's fallen into that mid-range. So what they did, even though it was the middle and upper class ladies that were pushing for it, what they found was they liked molding the girls that fall into this class. Actually, this is the class of girls they liked in nursing. They were malleable and controllable, I think these were some of the desirable characteristics of nurses at the time. They were trainable and biddable. So that was just might be interesting. So I'm just looking, this is the area we're looking at. So there's the map of Tipperary, and the orange spots there are where there were, that's the major, it's really just the towns where there was workhouses. I think there was workhouses in all of those, but they're the major towns, so not the ones we're looking at. So these red dots here are where there was dispensaries, and the green dots where we had the workhouses. So Borrisokane and Nina had a workhouse and an infirmary, and then Carrigahorig and Clough-Jordan also had dispensaries. And then in the Nina area, we had the one at Nye, and I'm sure everybody knows that building at Nye Cross, it says dispensary, built in 1856. So that would have been where the doctor would have come to. Actually, very recently, in Nina Guardian, Danny Grace had a lovely article on Dr. Robert Morton, and he would have been the dispensary doctor there up to 1905, just before he died. And he said his own relative would have been the caretaker there. So that's the dispensary at Nye. There was one in Portrue, in Ballina, Newport, in the silver mines, and in Tumivara, and there was in Nina as well. It would have been in Summerhill and Nina, as well as then the workhouse and the infirmary then at the workhouse. So just to show just the geography of it there. And then in terms of the statistics, so in 1882, we're looking at a population based on the 1881 census of the kind of the Nina Union area would have had 30,000, and the Borrisokane Union area would have had just over 10,000 people. And then within the workhouse, you had on a daily basis, kind of 350, say, down to about 250. So a lessening amount as the time went on, and this high enough number of admissions during the year. So that's, you know, it's showing there's a certain number of the population are probably fairly static, they're long stay, but there's this short stay thing going on as well. And then there's also the outdoor relief. So that's where destitute poor are given either food or food stamps or money, and they're not living in the workhouse. Now, Nina Workhouse had a capacity of 1,000 inmates. So we're working here even by 1882, only, 40 years after it opened, you're working at a very low, like a third of its capacity. Down here, only a quarter of its capacity. It's only about a quarter full. And Borrisokane then, which would have opened in 1851, 52, that type of time. So 30 years after it opened, it had a capacity of 600, and it's working at way below that capacity. I mean, a sick down here in 1889. So very few people actually using the workhouse, but look at the turnover. We've got quite a big turnover. So indicative of people coming, staying for a time and leaving. And that would be typical if they're using the infirmary. And not so many on outdoor relief. Now, if we go to the next time period, so this is near the end, this is the last kind of figures I could get good data for within the time frame that I studied. But if you look, say, So we've got a lower population, so it's dropped by about 7,000 in Nina, it's dropped by about 3,000 in the Borsa-Cane Union. You're down to only about 50 people a day staying in the workhouse in Borsa-Cane, but you've got almost 2,000 using it within the year. So really showing that very much a turnover, people in, out, in, out. And I also have there the births, at the start of recording the births. You see the workhouse was not a place that many children were born, because at this era, really it is home deliveries, and that's the dispensary midwife is going to be doing those deliveries. And so same with Nina. Nina's really been underutilized, but I'd say what is being utilized is the infirmary part. And Nina would have been burnt in 1923 as part of the whole civil disputes that were happening. And they burnt the workhouse part, but they didn't burn the infirmary. And it's actually, I think there was maybe 11 people in the workhouse. And the rest were in the infirmary, and the infirmary continued. And it's actually on the site of St. Joseph's Hospital. So where the workhouse was, even though the workhouse is gone, that is actually where St. Joseph's Hospital in Nina is. So it's on the same site that they had the original workhouse and the infirmary continued on. Borsa-Cane in that year, Borsa-Cane closed with the founding of the Irish Free State and the change in the laws. There was, you can see, with only 50 inmates a year, there probably wasn't a lot of requirement for it. And I'm sure anyone who went to school in Borsa-Cane or near it knows that the buildings are still there in the grounds of the secondary school. Now, one big change that happened, the first change that happened, I suppose, in the workhouse, in the care of patients in the workhouse, was the introduction of nuns as nurses. So before we even get a very qualified nursing workforce in the workhouse infirmaries, the nuns, the Sisters of Mercy predominantly, applied to take over the nursing care in Limerick Union Workhouse at first. And they tried for a long time to get in there. The workhouses were actually non-denominational, and they didn't like there to be a predominance of any one religion working there. And they were really afraid that if they let the nuns in, they'd be proselytizing and trying to convert any Protestant patients over to Catholicism. So there was a strong objection on that part. So they were let in, I think, on the proviso that they would only care for the Catholic patients. So I think that worked. But they actually made a big impact, and they improved the care of patients. So then slowly, or maybe not so slowly, the Sisters of Mercy started making inroads and moving into other workhouses around the country, so that like by 1903, of the 163 workhouses in the country, 84 of the workhouses had Sisters of Mercy working in them. So that's quite a, it's quite a number. They came to Nina in 1882, and when the nuns set up took over in a workhouse, or they took over, say, the running of the infirmary, they would set up a small community there. So it wasn't like they stayed in their convent and then they came in from day to day. So some of the nuns from the convent in Nina actually formed another little community in the workhouse infirmary, and that consisted of 4 or 5 nuns, and that was consistent until the time that the workhouse infirmary kind of closed and became the general hospital. And the matron at the time had been the matron of the workhouse, which was a Sister Maxwell. Portumna also had Sisters of Mercy, and they came in 1886. Again, there was 4 nuns. They also had 1 lay nurse, and one of the member of the Workhouse Reform Association, Miss Catherine Wood, in 1896 said that the nuns had brought sweetness and light into many of those places. She meant the workhouse infirmaries, and there was no desire to drive them out. But a nun who was not trained in nursing the sick could never take the place of a trained nurse. And this is one of the arguments that this Workhouse Reform Association was making in 1896, is that they wanted trained nurses, and in places where the nuns were doing the nursing, they wanted them to be trained as well. They didn't want to drive them out, but they wanted them to be trained, because the nuns actually weren't trained as nurses. So what we had when the nuns did take over, so they did bring things like improved sanitation, they brought order, cleanliness, they brought stock control, they brought better behavior of the inmate nurses, and they brought better care of patients. Stock control, some of the drugs or the treatments that were used at this time included whiskey, brandy, and porter. So when there wasn't anybody watching the stock, a lot of those items would have gone missing. Definitely under the nuns' watch, they didn't, apparently. So the disadvantages, though, of the nuns were as nurses was they weren't qualified nurses. And a big one was they didn't do night duty. They finished work at 9 p.m. So if the only other nurses available were pauper nurses, sometimes the inmates or the inmates who were, or the patients in the infirmary didn't get any care during the night. Or if they did, there was often complaints that maybe the pauper nurses would charge for the care. They wouldn't. So if somebody was elderly, there was no light to get out of bed at night, they could fall out of bed and not be put back in again. This was a common complaint. They had that in the minutes of the Nenagh Board of Guardians meetings. This is one of the points that Dr. Minute is making, that, you know, people have fallen out of bed in the night and they've died of the cold or they've died of their fall. Now, that may have happened many years before he was making the claim, but he said, you know, this is the possibility. He really wanted, Dr. Minute wanted the qualified nurses. The other thing, the nuns didn't practice midwifery, and it was canon law forbade them from training as midwives, and that wasn't lifted until the 1950s. So they couldn't practice midwifery, and they were also forbidden from doing certain care of men, and also from some surgeries. So if there was anything a little bit indelicate or a little bit intimate in terms of intimate care of the body, the nuns weren't allowed to do it. So there was limits to what they could bring and what they could do. So in particular, so I suppose I was able to find a lot more information about Nenagh Workhouse, because there seemed to be a lot more problems there, I think, with their nursing staff than there was in Borrisokane. It was a lot more stable in Borrisokane. But in Nenagh, just a little bit of a case study, really. So there was a nurse Malloy employed for many years in Nenagh, and she kind of she was the only qualified nurse in the infirmary. She was there in 1880. But in that year, she was accused of neglecting patients, and she was also accused of being drunk more than once when she was on duty. Now, in terms of neglect of patients, there was a daughter of a patient said that she came to visit her mother, who was blind, and found that the mother hadn't been washed for 3 weeks, and her bed linen hadn't been washed, and it was infested with lice, and she didn't have a bottom sheet, and she was in dirty clothing. And to that, Miss Malloy said, but it's normal, we only wash the bed linen every 3 weeks. So that was, and she denied that she was drunk, but anyway, she did resign after being brought before the board. She resigned in April 1881. But because there was no one to replace her, she actually stayed on for another year. So she was there until April 1882. But with her resignation, that kind of opened up a post that and this is what the Board of Guardians had been hoping for. They said, if the post opens, we'd love to offer it to the Sisters of Mercy. And that's what they did. They kind of advertised and said that the post would be available to the Sisters of Mercy if they wanted it. But the Sisters of Mercy did say, yes, we will come and do it, but they needed accommodation built onto the workhouse infirmary for them, so they could have their little mini convent, if you like. And then they also went off to Thurles to be trained in how to run the workhouse infirmary. So that took nearly the year, and then they took over then in April of 1882. But therein the problems didn't stop, because they didn't do the night duty, and so there was issues with nursing staff in Nenagh. There was also, as well as the workhouse infirmary, on the grounds in Nenagh Workhouse, there was a fever hospital. And the fever hospital in 1880 was run by a woman who was named Bridget Carroll. Now, Bridget got sick and died, and in the latter, she kind of died while she was still in service. She hadn't been a trained nurse, but she'd worked as the fever nurse for years. And as she was getting ill, her daughter Bridget as well was helping her. And then when her mother died, the Board of Guardians offered the role to Bridget, the daughter Bridget, and she took it. She took the job as the fever nurse. So she wasn't qualified, but she was very capable. And then Bridget got married to the workhouse schoolmaster. His name was Michael Reynolds, and they had 2 children. So while they were both employed under the institution of the workhouse, Michael Reynolds would have had accommodation as the schoolhouse, as the workhouse schoolmaster, probably off the boys' dormitory. And Bridget herself had accommodation in the fever hospital. But then it was sad for Bridget. When Michael retired, he was no longer able to stay in his accommodation, and himself and the children got accommodation downtown. But anyway, in 1894, there was an outbreak of typhus in Neenah, and it kind of ran through the RIC barracks. And one of the constables he died, and the district inspector for the RIC made a claim to the Board of Guardians and said, look, we need more nurses to look after the 3 patients that we still have in the hospital, the 3 officers. The Board of Guardians' response to that was that Bridget Reynolds was the nurse, she had an assistant, and between the 2 of them, they should be well able to do day and night duty caring for the 3 patients. So essentially, Bridget would have to have worked 12 hours a day, every day until those patients left. And the same with her assistant. One would have done, I suppose, nights and the other days. So a lot was expected of these nurses. And it was either a feast or a famine. So a lot of the time it was empty. Now, I think if the fever hospital was empty, Bridget then would have worked in the workhouse infirmary. But when there was fever, she worked there. And there was also, when the fever hospital was busy, they could look for pauper nurses to help them, but they sometimes refused. There was cases taken to the petty sessions in Neenah where pauper nurses refused to work in the fever hospital because they didn't want to pick up the diseases that were there. It wasn't really a very safe place to work. So Bridget, anyway, Michael and the children were living downtown in Neenah, and then he got sick and needed to be looked after. I think he had a bronchitis or something with his chest. So Bridget kind of brought him into her accommodation in the fever hospital, but didn't look for permission for that. And her husband was discovered there when she called for Dr. Minnett to see him and admit him to the infirmary. And Bridget then was brought up in front of the board and disciplined. And only one man stood up for her and said, look, this is, her husband isn't well and she was only looking after him. So stopped her from being dismissed at that point. And really within a couple of weeks, her husband had died. But then as a counter move, Bridget complained about abuses of some of the men in position of power in the workhouse, and they decided we can't be having any of that. So they then dismissed her. And Bridget had said that her plans were to emigrate to Australia with her children, that her sister was there. I'm not sure if that, I haven't been able to verify that, but that was Bridget's plan. So that's how Bridget was treated. Now, this is the next lady who worked in the workhouse. I find fascinating because this wasn't a Neenah woman at all. She was a Dublin woman. Margaret Frances Carroll. She was a widow by the time she came to Neenah in 1897. So she had married when she was about 18. Her father was an engine driver with a railway company or a train company in Dublin, and they lived in railway cottages, newly built red brick 2-story semi-detached houses in Great Western Square in Dublin. And I think those houses are still there, but they were new when the Carroll family moved into them. And they seemed to have a lodger who was an engine. He was also involved in the railway, and it was his name was James Turner. He was about 42, and it was him that Margaret married. They had 5 children together, and then he died in 1895. He was only 48. So 2 years later, we see Margaret applying for the position of midwife in Neenah. and getting it. And she has a qualification. So possibly between Jane's dying and her taking up the position in Nina, she has gone to the Rotunda possibly and gotten a qualification in midwifery. And at this time, there was a lot of people had qualifications in Dublin and there wasn't enough jobs for them. So I suppose she was looking for a place with a job. So even though Nina seems like a long way from Dublin, it was on the train line. So that might have been advantageous to her. And she applied, just after getting the job, she applied to have her 6-year-old daughter Alice come to live with her in the workhouse. Now, from the 1901 census, we see that her other children, 2 of them are living with her father, her sister and her brother in the house in Great Western Square. The 2 younger children are boys. And then the 2 older girls seem to be in a boarding school / orphanage in Mountjoy Square. But by 1911, census, she's actually has remarried. So she married an RAC constable, Michael Doughton, in 1902, and they have 4 more children, 4 daughters, but one, Henrietta Margaret, dies when she was only about 5 weeks old of diarrhea or some sort of gastric problem. And also by that time, some of her older children have moved to Nina. So she is working as an independent midwife by the 1911 census in the Nina area, and she did so until 1922. But of course, in a lot with the troubles that were occurring in the country in 1922, all the ex-IRIC officers and their families were given a weekend to quit the town, and they left it in June of 1922. So Margaret and her husband and the 3 younger daughters, they went to Liverpool, and she died there about 4 years later in 1926. She was only in her 50s. But in between that, Alice, the little girl who had come with her when she first moved to Nina, was 26 when the influenza pandemic hit Nina. The second wave of it between 1918 and 19, and Alice, she was a typist, but she died in that pandemic. So I find Margaret really is reflective of an awful lot that was happening in society at that time. She was widowed, married a second time, 2 families. She had affected by the troubles. She was qualified as a midwife, and she lost a child with the influenza pandemic. So that's Margaret. I'd love to get a picture of Margaret. I'd love to find out what happened to her children. So I just have this. This is I found this is one of the sources I used a lot in my work, in my research, and it's if any of you are familiar with Irish genealogy. .ie, and it's got all the photocopies of the pages from the birth registers and the death and the marriage, but this is a birth register. And I just find in the yellow highlight, you'll see Margaret Doughton's name. But if you look at the top entry here of her, so on the 12th of July, 1906, she gave birth to Henrietta Margaret. She's the mother reporting the birth herself. But then on the 8th of August, so not quite a month later, she is the midwife present at birth. And she is for the rest of that month there as well. So she didn't get much maternity leave, did Margaret. She was back working and delivering babies very soon after having her own child. I've also highlighted there in green is Winifred Hogan. So Winifred Hogan is one of the midwives that I see cropping up on these birth registers for Nina quite a bit. And on the bottom here, Catherine Moore, very prolific midwife that worked in Nina for many, many years. I don't think she wasn't qualified, but she had worked as a midwife. Now, Nina, so we've spoken a bit about the workhouse and the infirmary. Nina had ongoing problems with staff, and there was either too much or too few, and the workhouses were never built to have a lot of staff. All the work was meant to be done by the inmates. So when you start employing staff, then they need accommodation. And this was something that was a big problem in Nina. They were running out of room for all these nurses. And then there was times when there was fever, they needed more nurses, and they often applied to Cork, Fever Street Hospital in Dublin, and to Barrington's Hospital for staff. So then they'd have to put them up. And sometimes they ended up being in the local hotel. So the Board of Guardians were not happy, and Dr. Minute used to order these nurses and go above the board because he had the power to do so, and they were really not pleased. They weren't one bit pleased with that because it cost them money. And so what happened to the other, like Thurles, as I mentioned, had a workhouse. So that we now know it as what do we call it now? It's an aged care facility, but it's the it would have been the county home, I suppose, at one stage, but it's a very, very good facility for the elderly now. But it became the county home, and it had some mother and baby beds. Roscrea was very busy. It had a sanatorium for people with TB. It had a district hospital, and it had a mother and baby home. And then Bursacane closed, and Nina became the district hospital. So that's what happened there. So this is just over the period of time from 1853 to 1916, the number of midwives employed in dispensary districts really increased. There was a push constantly to have qualified midwives employed in the dispensary district. So by 1916, around Ireland, we had 789. Now in Nina, we had Rosaleen Waterson for about 17 years. She was one of the first qualified midwives employed as a dispensary midwife, so on the district. And then her caseload, just as an idea, her caseload in 1915 was 87. So that's ticket cases. So 87 people who got free care under the dispensary system. And then she was also expected to take private cases. So that wasn't their entire workload. She definitely had the highest workload compared to, if you look at Annie Lyons, she had maybe 52 cases in the year. And then you go to Newport and Portrue. Now Portrue, there was a couple of shared posts there, but you still only have, say, Portrue, these two posts, Marianne Nolan and Josephine Carey. There was 17, say, cases between them, 17 in Newport, and in Silvermines 10, and Toomevara 17. So you've got a way lower caseload than you had sort of in Nina, and that each case involved about 3 or 5 visits during and after birth. So I find Rosaleen Waterson is also a very interesting character. She wasn't from Nina either. So that's an interesting thing as well I found in my research, is these nurses weren't static. They didn't just stay where they were from. They moved to where the jobs were. And if another poorer area had better pay, they moved there as well. So they'd move between areas. But Rosaleen was widowed at only 21. Her husband had been a jockey. They lived in Kildare, and he died of tuberculosis. He was only 21 himself. She was employed in Nina as the midwife from 1902 to 1919, and then she left to marry a widower, and she was the third wife of Arthur McCarthy, and he had 9 children from his 2 previous marriages, and some of those younger children were very, very much babies when Rosaleen married him. And she died in 1931, so she wasn't terribly old when she died either. She died in Limerick Hospital. She was employed in 1902 at a salary of £20 per annum, and that was with accommodation, but it was about £5 less than most midwives were getting in other areas. And she also had a very busy area. So she came up against the board a lot, and she had an advocate in Mabel Dease. I was looking through Danny Grace's latest book, and he has a piece on Mabel Dease. She's a very interesting lady who lived in Nina for a while. Mabel was on the board of guardians at, and so she was a guardian. She was a lady guardian. The ladies could join the board of guardians from 1896. There weren't any in Bursacane, but there was 2 ladies voted onto the board around this period in Nina, and Mabel Dease was one of them. And she advocated for Rosaleen to get higher wages, but they were very, very reluctant to increase her wages. And one of the arguments she made was that, number one, her caseload was very high with poor patients, and the more poor patients she had, that gave her less time to take on private patients. And also some of the private patients didn't want to employ her because she was going into very poor places. So it was this kind of catch-22. Now Rosaleen, I'm not sure if she actually suffered a lot of ill health, but she took time off nearly every year with lumbago and different issues. But these midwives didn't get paid leave. They usually had to pay for someone to replace them. And the other thing she had to pay for that she complained about was if she was called out at night time in the middle of winter, she had to pay for the car that brought her. Now, I'd say that was it wasn't a motor car, it would have been a horse and cart, but whatever transport she got in the middle of the night sorry, I'm losing my car here. Sorry, I have to turn on it. Sorry about that. I turned off the power so that you wouldn't see the lights, and now I've had to turn it back on again. Sorry about that. Yeah, so it was expensive. You know, she found that expensive. She was on. It wasn't high wages for what she was doing. And there we see Rosaline's name then. The dispensary for Nina was in Summerhill, so she would have lived in Summerhill in Nina, but she also covered the Nye area as well. Now, by comparison to the problems that Rosaline had, the midwife for the Borrisokane and Terry Glass area was a lady who was originally from Rathcabbin. She was Ellen or Helen Bennett, nee Redden. So she was a Redden from Rathcabbin, and she was a widow with 2 small boys when she became the midwife in Borrisokane and Terry Glass around 1900. And she did both districts for about 10 years. And then the Board of Guardians said, oh no, you can't do both districts anymore because you have to be resident in the district that you're working in. So she was living in Borrisokane, she wasn't living in Terry Glass, so they took the Terry Glass district from her. And she was good, she wangled. Well, she appealed to them and said this was unfair, that, you know, she'd established, you know, she relied on the work and the income. So I think she got some sort of a deal. She got a few extra pounds a year for just doing the Borrisokane district. But the nurse who took over from her only lasted less than a year. She was on £25 a year. She was a widow called Mrs. Henderson, who would come from Roscrea, and she had 5 children, but she said she was unable to live on the income. So I imagine in that period of time, she hadn't been able to establish enough of a private business. Helen Bennett went on to marry James Kelly in 1907, and they had 2 more children, and they also built Bella Vista Nursing Home. And when she retired in 1947, the post was taken over by her daughter Mary, who was known as Nurse Ahern. Now, I'm sure there's plenty of people on this call who either have a parent or a grandparent who was delivered by Nurse Ahern, because I know my own grandmother was attended by Nurse Ahern even for my mother's birth. And my eldest aunt was born in Bella Vista Nursing Home in Borrisokane. So I'd say there's a lot of people have connection to Nurse Ahern. So Nurse Ahern was the daughter of the previous nurse for the Borrisokane and for time Terry Glass area. As I said, I mentioned there, I've used the birth registers very much for information, and I think I've gone over my time now. But what I have here at the end that might be of interest, and I have it ready to send, is the list of all the names I came across in the birth registers, where they worked, the years, and whether they were district midwives or that. So I think I might just leave it at that, and because I think I've gone over my time, and I thank you all very much, and I hope that was interesting.
Thanks, Lisa. That was great.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I think in fairness, you kept to your time all right, but I think we could have listened to you for another while. Very, very interesting. And I just see, I think it was Joanne Thurl put in a note early on in the time, and I think it sums it up. Lisa, your talk, she said, wonderful scholarship, Lisa, and the research you have done. And I don't think there's any doubt in that. I know, just looking up the census now and again, just looking up for genealogy, what it takes just to go through them. But like you have gone through them with a small, what did you say?
Fine tooth comb.
Comb. Yeah, so like You mentioned the census there, and I suppose it's something to bear in mind is that very shortly the 1921 census will be coming online. And that again will probably add to all our research. But you use the census quite a lot, but also Irish genealogy, looking at the nurses.
Yes, I used the registers, and actually, Helen, I found that really, I don't know what made me think of it. Maybe it was I was looking up something, and I realized in that column where it's who notified the birth, definitely for the Nina area, less so for the Borrisokane area. A lot of times it was the midwife or the nurse that attended the birth that actually notified the birth. And it gave me this whole group of names and women that we might never have recorded anywhere else. So I was just so excited by that. It was tedious. It was tedious work. I picked particular years and I went through the whole, every birth for that year for those to see who it could find. But that's what that table at the end, I sent it as a PDF to Niall. So I think if anybody is interested in that list of names, it's there. It can be emailed to you. I'm quite happy for people to have that information.
Yeah, perfect. We will bring in a few people now if they want to ask a question, or we'll read some of the comments, Lisa. But just one thing that struck me, we did a research some time ago, and we came up, it was with regards to a lady that was midwife, and the amount of miles that they walked.
Yeah.
And some of them didn't even have bicycles. That they covered a huge amount of ground.
Massive. And that's what I said about Rosalind Waterson. Like, she was saying, if it was the middle of the night and you couldn't walk, or it was too far, she was then having to hire somebody to bring her. So then there was extra expense in that. I mean, if you ever want me back, I have the next part of the talk would be about the district nurses, because that's a whole other story. But they had bikes. The public health nurse, they were slightly different than the district midwives. So that stage, I think they had a bike.
Very good. Lisa, I'm just going to take a few of the comments here. Margaret Kennedy just said, just fascinating. You have great delivery too. Could stay listening all night. And I think
Thanks, Margaret.
we agree with that. James Heenan says, well done, Lisa. Great presentation. E. Cadwell, did workhouses report statistics annually to a central body?
Yes. Yes, and that's another great source of information, and you can get it free of charge on archive.org. And it was the annual report of the Poor Law Commissioners. So again, I have the that's the other thing I could send. I have the bibliography from my thesis, and all of those links would be on that. So I think I'll add that in as well if anybody wants that. But that was a fantastic source. Actually, I have to thank Donald Murphy. I don't know, people in Nina will know Donald, a fantastic historian. And he lent me some documents right at the beginning when he heard I was doing this research. And one of them was a hard copy of one of those reports, annual reports, and that let me know that these things were available. Now I found the various years on archive.org, but just even knowing that they existed, and they were tomes, these massive tomes with so much information in them, really fascinating.
There's a comment here from Anne, who I think maybe a friend of yours. Miss Doyle would be so proud of you. Excellent.
Thank you, Anne. Miss Doyle was our English teacher.
Mary Prout just says, Lisa, well done, fantastic. I could listen to you all night. Fantastic research, nothing left out. Fine to come job. And then there's Regina is looking for, I would appreciate the table of nurses. So what we will do is that if everyone would like, maybe we would send out that table of nurses to anyone that attended tonight. Mary, the Irish genealogy website is free, and maybe that's something we might just include as well, the link to that. Regina, again, excellent presentation, and E. Cardwell as well. If there's anyone there that would like to come to unmute yourself and ask Lisa something or comment, please do so. You can unmute yourself now if anyone would like to come in. While if there is someone there that wants to come in, please let us know. You can unmute yourself.
And I'm just wondering, would people be happier if we stopped recording, or will we leave the recording run?
Yeah, maybe just stop recording. Maybe, Niall. What do you think, Lisa? You okay with that?
I'm fine, yeah. Whatever. I'm easy.
And if someone just wants to come in, we're coming to that time of the year as well. Maybe just at Christmas as well. If someone just wants to come in and say hello, you're more than welcome as well.
Okay, so I stop. Thanks, Lisa, for that.
Thanks, Niall.
Lisa, just